Hello, everybody in the great wide universe of the universe. I'm Marcella Hammer. I am the resident unicorn of the palette community. And I am so excited to be here for Get Your Mind Right. This is a digital program where I get to bring in incredible special guests from the palette community and beyond to talk about mental health. What the heck is going on in our minds and our brains and our bodies, and how do we take care of ourselves first? That's key. We've all kind of learned that, right? So, okay, I'm super hyped to introduce my guest today. This is Ben Carlin. He's a palette member, but most importantly, he is kind of like a dude guru in many ways. And Ben, welcome.
Thank
Welcome,
you.
welcome to the internet with me.
It's great to be here.
Um, okay. So would you tell everybody watching about what you do and about Freeform Minds, which is your incredible company?
Thank you. Sure. So my name is Ben Carlin, and I run Freeform Minds, which is a a mindfulness-based business consultancy. And so we're helping people, amongst many things, to understand a little bit more about how we are using our minds and bodies to do the work that we do. And that is a topic that addresses health and wellness. It's a topic that addresses creativity. It's a topic that addresses how we communicate. And so, of course, everybody has these needs, businesses particularly. And in a world that is getting increasingly complicated and stressful, figuring out how to meaningfully embody the values that we want to bring into our work is hard to do. So we help people to build the structures that enable them to do that more consistently, as well as to train their team members to be able to uphold those cultural values in the way that they work. So that is a topic that brings us to a lot of different other topics. And I found my way here just through mindfulness and meditation, and the inner tools that those practices have empowered me with apply across the board. And our ability to make them available to our clients is just the way that we make this really ancient practice into something that people today can tap into.
I think meditation is such a game changer. It
Mhm.
has certainly been in my life, but there are a lot of people who were like, I can't sit still. It's not for me. Or like, can you how do you deal with that when you meet someone who's just not feeling it? How do you encounter that a lot, and how do you try and open that door with someone?
Yeah, I encounter it constantly, and I'm happy to find it because I think it reflects the opportunity that we as a culture are faced with right now as we kind of collide against the wall of the somewhat limited frameworks that we have for taking care of ourselves. And as the conditions of the moment, which of course is a pandemic, and all of the stressors that have been exacerbated that were already in place before that, we're all finding that there's just a need for a different approach. And many people are open to whatever that is, regardless of what it looks or feels or sounds like, if it works. And now that we have the tools of modern medicine in terms of the diagnostic science that can look at your brain and see what's happening in a brain scan as you go through meditative practice, it's easier than ever to just give it a try and see what happens. And once you do that, you start to experience the results.
Basically, science says you should try it because it's real.
And more
Just saying.
importantly, your experience will validate that reality. The science is a good way to open the door, and then sort of be your own judge once you step through, see what you find there. But taking the time to examine it is what gives you the experience to verify that.
I think that is the biggest challenge that everyone is running into right now. And by everyone, I mean me and everybody else. And it's something you mentioned, taking care of ourselves. That I think can be the biggest problem and the biggest challenge for a lot of us. We have families, we have spouses, we have kids, we have dogs, we have cats, we have all of these external stimuli. And sometimes putting yourself first is like the last thing you think you can do, but it's the most important thing to do because otherwise you're dead.
Uh-huh. Yeah, absolutely. So you've really just cut right to the core of that paradox. The first step to untangling this web is the realization that we've only got so much. And if
Mhm.
we expend that beyond a certain point, it's not coming back. And so that's reality. And many people experience that reality in the form of burnout. It is a chronic thing that is sweeping across industries where it didn't exist before. And in the industries where it did exist, it's worse than ever. And that's, of course, in places like healthcare, understandably so, which, of course, are the people we depend on to get us all through things like pandemics. So we're looking at a time where the stress is higher than it's ever been. And this question of taking care of ourselves is both more important than ever, but also more unattainable than ever.
Mhm.
The functional reality of how do we do that is the question. And mindfulness is a key towards finding those answers, in the sense that by building awareness of the moment around us and of the experience we're having inside of us, it starts to sensitize us to some very critical realities. In some cases, it's like, oh, I've been working all day and I haven't drank any water. And now that I've taken a moment to check in with myself, I've realized that. And oh, maybe that's why I have a headache. And oh, maybe that's why I'm exhausted. And suddenly you begin to connect the dots to all these things that we're too busy to notice. And once we make a practice of noticing, we suddenly find opportunities to meaningfully engage with our well being.
So when you say check in with yourself, tell me what you mean.
Yeah. So when we're talking about a mindfulness practice, we're talking about a practice of intentionally bringing our attention into the moment. And so, what that means is, in many cases, just focusing on something that's here and now. And a common mindfulness practice is focusing on the breath. And the reason for that is because the mind can wander off to the past or the future or wherever it wants to go, but the breath is always here. So, if you're tuning into your breath, some degree of your awareness is in the present moment. And when our attention's in the present moment, the mind and body begin to respond to what we find. It's like when we're hunched over our desks all day, we don't notice that accumulated tension. But as soon as we stand up from our desks, awareness is suddenly directed to the body. And we very naturally just begin to move. We don't
Oh
even
my
need to
gosh.
ourselves.
Ben, I feel you. I feel like I've spent weeks like this with no
Mm,
neck.
yep.
It really is a good effect with my sweater on today, too. It
Yes. That one shift is a meaningful shift towards well being. The difference between having your shoulders up by your ears and having them down at your sides means that you've got better posture, which means that you're breathing more deeply. It means you're getting better circulation and blood flow, particularly through your neck up towards your head and your brain. And a lot of people getting migraines at the end of their workday may have actually been just literally cutting off blood flow to their brain because their posture is so out of keeping with their well being. And we don't notice that if it's for like one moment, one moment, one moment, and maybe 10 calls came in that moment, or we had an unexpected crisis, or we had a meeting that didn't go well. And so we put it off, or we don't even notice, but it catches up with us.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like a creaky Victorian house when I rotate my neck right now.
Ah,
And, that kind of brings me back to the burn topic.
hmm,
It's a word that we hear a lot in media and probably from our friends and, in the world. And it's really easy to say, yeah, I feel like I have burnout. But I think that a lot of people, including myself, were like, okay, but what do I do? But what do I do?
mhm.
Like, how, what, now what? Yeah, I got it.
That question is worth having at the center of our attention as we examine any given answer to like what people are saying about burnout and how people are examining well-being, and like some people mean it and some people are just kind of pushing that down to the next version of the question that won't answer it either. And so we're in a world that is keen on selling us answers to this question, whether they answer the question or not. And part of why that is problematic, in addition to the fact that it doesn't really get us there, is that there's not one answer. And so,
What? Wait, come
sorry,
on now.
disclaimer,
What are we
not
doing
one
here?
answer to life. I'm sorry. I should have started with that, but now that we've gotten it out, I'll
Fine,
help understand how that actually is a good thing.
fine.
Because with present moment awareness as the framework with which we're addressing our needs, we are allowed to make space for the specifics of what we're experiencing. So to follow the example of just our shoulders up by our ears, it's like, okay, we notice this one day at work, now that we're having this conversation about awareness, that, okay, I can drop my shoulders down. And now that I've done that, maybe I notice what you just said about your neck, that it creaks now when I'm moving it a lot. And now I can maybe make more of a habit of keeping my shoulders down now that I see this happening. Maybe I'll start to notice differences in how my neck is feeling. Maybe that's going to help me kind of sit up a little bit more upright in my seat, because in order for my neck to not hang forward, I need it more aligned with my body. And then, of course, our spinal column starts to do a lot of the work that our back muscles and our shoulder were doing to sort of creep up here to hold us in this posture that's really energy intensive. And now our whole physiology is starting to change. And correspondingly, the energy that we have moving through our day, the kind of health problems we might be facing down the road, all these things now are being engaged with in a meaningful and functional way. And it starts with one moment.
But you said there's not one answer, but it starts with one moment. I'm confused. Get me to this moment. Let's do this.
Okay. So when we are tuning into our breath, which is what happens in all of the mindfulness practices that I teach in the beginning, we always start with the breath because it's right there. It's very clear whether we're focused on our breath or not. That willingness to engage with some aspect of the moment provides us with an anchor, just like a ship in a storm. And when that storm really kicks up, it's hard to focus. Like our anchor starts to drag, we get pulled away, and then we come back. And each time we are able to re-engage with that focus, something's actually happening in our brain through this process called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is the process by which your brain learns how to do new things. Every time you learn a new skill, it starts out a little awkward. And when you do it over and over again, suddenly it's second nature. And that's because your brain has changed its physical structure in order to help you facilitate that outcome in an easier and easier way.
Um, we've been through a lot in the past couple of years,
Mhm.
and I think it's worth kind of just acknowledging that our brains have changed as a result of that as
Yes.
well.
Yes, totally. So this neuroplasticity thing cuts both ways. You're absolutely right. When we're doing something over and over again, certain neurons fire in the brain and wire together with synapses and create a new physical structure, which is great if it's aligned around something you're trying to learn. But if it's something like, for example, stress, well, the more stressed we get, the easier it is to get stressed. And many of us may have found that we're in the middle of a time when we're actually able to relax, and the mind is intent on dragging us to all the things that we're stressed about, even though they're not happening right now. And that is a recipe for perpetual exhaustion. The mind
I
is
know that recipe.
oh, yeah,
I
you got
do by heart.
it.
Um, Another thing I wanted to ask you about is the connection between burnout and shame.
Ooh,
And
yeah.
I think that I don't know. I
Mhm.
just wrote it down and
Yeah.
I remember why, but I think that it's like you want to be able to do everything,
Mhm.
and if you can't do everything and you're burning yourself out, but you still feel like you need to do, like, what do we do? How do
Yeah.
you make that disconnect?
It's such an important question, and it is actually manifesting in a very powerful and painful way as the pandemic continues to rage on, which is that healthcare professionals experiencing burnout and grappling with the decision about whether they're going to keep going back into the trenches over and over and over again. The decision is weighted in a much heavier way than somebody in a different form of work, because so much of what someone goes into the healthcare field for is because they feel this calling to help people. And there is this sense of worth and value that we might derive from being able to be of service in a certain way. And so when we are acting in a way that is in accordance with our values and we're really trying hard and doing our best, and just this siege of stress keeps mounting, when we find that we've reached that breaking point, it may be hard to admit that. because we're connected to these other ideas of who we're supposed to be and how a failure might reflect on something about us as a person, instead of just reaching this energy point where we just don't have any more to give. It's like thinking we're a bad person because our car ran out of gas. It's not a moral question. It's just an energy equation. But because of this element of shame, we may not be willing to look at it that way, and we may hold ourselves to a standard we wouldn't ever hold someone else to. So I think the first step is the acknowledgement of that, the awareness of it. And that awareness is always the first step. Without it, we get trapped in these cycles that we never break out of until we burn out of them.
Well, I'm shook and humbled, and I needed to hear this.
Mm.
I agree. Like, I definitely hold myself personally to higher standards and ask more of myself than anyone around me does, or that I would ask of anyone else. And I remember once upon a time in 2021, we were still having this conversation because this is not something that like I can just snap my fingers like a lot of professionals. Like, we can't just say, okay, well then I'm not burnt out now, I took a nap, like I'm cool.
Mhm.
It's like really not that simple. But you told me this story about sharpening an axe. Can you share that, because I need to hear it again?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a story my father shared with me. And it's a story about a man chopping down trees with an axe. And there's someone else watching him cut down these trees. And the guy keeps cutting down these trees. And over time, he seems to be slowing down. And the other person who's observing him eventually chooses to approach and says, "Hey, I don't want to interrupt, but I've noticed that because you've cut down so many trees, your axe has gotten a little dull, and you might want to sharpen it. It would make it easier for you to keep going. You wouldn't have to exert so much energy to do all this." And the guy with the axe looks up at him and he says, "I don't have any time to sharpen my axe. I've got to cut down all these trees." And that story sticks with me because it so clearly identifies the paradox that we're talking about here. We know that there's a need, but there's just no time. And that's part of the problem. And so there's not even an opportunity to look for solutions, nevertheless, implement them. And when it comes to what you and I talked about back then, which is how do we sharpen our axe, this is where meditation comes in. And there's a wide range of scientific research about this, literally thousands of studies that show all the different ways that this practice affects the mind and body. But you don't need any of that to actually try it out. And when we begin to move through the process of a mindfulness practice, we find that it is as direct and as available as the process of physical exercise. It's not mysterious. It's not something reserved for a certain kind of person. It's something that requires effort and energy, but that if you have a good framework for it, it's easier than it might otherwise be. And when you get into the habit of it, it gets even easier.
I love this because everyone is different. We all approach things differently, but even just structuring meditation in a way like you're learning a sport.
Mhm.
Anyone can pick up a basketball and go to a basketball court and like you figure it out. Like, you
Mhm.
can figure it out. But if you have a framework, it'll help you get there a heck of a lot faster and
Mhm.
feel a heck of a lot better when you try and make a jump shot.
Yes,
A lot better.
absolutely. Yeah.
So where does someone find a framework? And I just like behoove anyone who is watching this to never forget the sharpen your axe story, because I think about that all the time. That I am giving and giving and working. And so many of us are like, we're all working so hard. Like, Ben, I know you are too. You're not just like chilling, meditating 24 hours a day, maybe take a break to eat a snack and some Cheerios. Like, we're all giving so much. And you have to figure out the paradox. Like, you have to set a boundary and take the time to sharpen the axe, or you're gonna die. You're gonna die of
Yeah.
blunt.
Yeah. And at some point we have to kind of be that direct with ourselves. It's like the bank account eventually hits zero. It's like, what are you paying with? What's like, where's this all coming from? This energy that you feel you have so little of, but you're setting yourselves up to have to spend much more of. It's like we can see the unsustainability of it. And the fact that we can't see anything else is what's so scary. It's not a lack of awareness that this is not a sustainable path. It's the fear of looking too closely at that and not finding an alternative. And so, this question of how do you find a framework is an excellent one. And it is one of the reasons why I am so enamored with mindfulness as a framework for well being. Because this idea of present moment awareness, it starts out really simply. It's like, okay, I'm focused on my breath. And for many of us, that's a pretty underwhelming experience. It's like, all right, I'm just breathing.
Yeah,
There's
like you don't get floating. You don't get
right.
float.
Yeah,
You don't
exactly.
levitate.
Yeah. Like people do have interesting experiences at times, and sometimes someone sits down for the very first time and something cool happens, but like that's not typical.
Yeah,
And
it's not
also
like you're on drugs, guys. Like I think you
right.
all know that.
In the same way that some people physically exercise for the first time and they're like, oh, this is great. And most people kind of hate that person because everybody else thinks exercising is painful and exhausting. And it's not because one is better than the other. It's because maybe you happen to have a knack for this, so the beginning is easier, and maybe you don't. And that doesn't mean you can't do it. And so that framework of shame that you talked about earlier takes on other forms. Like there's a sort of a less potent form of shame, which is like, I'm not that kind of person, which is maybe when we're being more protective about the way we frame it, something that we say is like just a personality type, like, oh, it's just not for me. But maybe when we look a little bit more deeply, we're saying, I'm not capable of that. And how do you know? Well, this framework of awareness is so interesting because it's immediately available. It's like you can focus on your breath, I'm sure of it. If you can't, like you've got bigger issues than mindfulness going on. Like you might need to see a doctor. Like
Mhm.
so it's so simple. But that simplicity opens up this opportunity for us to begin examining things a little differently. Like a big part of the problem with all this is that there's no time to look at it all. And so taking that time and having it correspond with an activity that has demonstrable health benefits, which makes it a little bit easier for us to justify taking that time. It allows us to undergo this journey of discovery in a way that is not at all metaphorical. It is a way that is as literal as this noticing of every time I sit down at my desk, my whole upper body collapses on itself, and how that might perhaps be impacting my well-being, and how that journey, like first moment of awareness, leads to this journey of understanding our bodies better. And then maybe like we go and get a massage or something because wow, it really is pretty uncomfortable like that. Maybe we start doing yoga or acupuncture, or maybe we just take a minute to get up off of our desks once an hour and walk around for a few minutes.
Mhm.
And that awareness is the key that unlocks any one of those doors. And the ongoing attention to the moment is what lets us know if we're on the right track and if we should keep moving.
I love this conversation so much, and the word framework keeps coming back to me. And for anyone who's on LinkedIn watching this, or anyone who is in business, or like is a human being that's an adult, we have to make difficult decisions every day. And we have to respond to the situations around us, whether it's within our family or our businesses, and we have to make tough calls and implement action as a result. But I think there is this we're hesitant to even give ourselves permission to problem solve with our own bodies when we feel like crap.
Mm,
I
yeah.
know that certainly I'm really good at making excuses because we want success. We're ambitious. We have big goals. We have big plans. And or like a kid over there just pooped itself in a diaper and needs to be dealt with. It's so difficult. But even just for me, like this conversation is making me think about how if we treat ourselves the way we treat the world around us and say like this is a problem, like my neck sounds like a creaky haunted Victorian mansion when I try to move it. Like this is not okay. This is going to have to be dealt with now, not later, not tomorrow. Yeah, maybe I got to change that diaper. It's not, I don't really have to change any diapers. But does that make sense, Ben? Like you're with me?
Yeah, we're talking about a paradigm shift.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of a highly pressurized form of work is how we've all been trained to do things. It's like, okay, there's a lot to do, there's a lot of pressure, and so use that. Let it sort of pressurize you and push you forward. And that does work. It does. But it costs. Like, you have to pay for it. And the costs are extreme, and they don't recoup on themselves. Like, it's the definition of unsustainable. And so when we look at this capacity for making space in our moment, which is what a mindfulness practice is in some ways. It's like, okay, there's a million things going on. I have a lot to do. I'm choosing for at least one breath, and preferably for maybe a few breaths, to just be in this moment, to let my mind and body be here without the need to do anything or think anything. And things will be thought, like thoughts will come up. It's not about not having thoughts, it's about not needing to do anything right now for just a second. And when we're really busy, the mind is going to say, you don't have that second. It's not available to you. You can't make that choice, but you can. You, in fact, can. And what happens if we make that choice even once is that we get the opportunity to examine if our approach is really getting us where we want to go. Because in the intensity of the moment, we sometimes make decisions that are not always the best decisions. Like, that's a very normal human thing. In fact, the neurological realities of how our brain functions when we're stressed is fundamentally different than how our brain functions when we're not. The prefrontal cortex up here, where our creativity and our communication skills and our higher logic functioning, all the stuff we use for our work, it's literally the first thing to shut off when we experience stress. And it turns out that's an essential survival mechanism, because if you're in like a real dangerous situation, like, intellectual thinking might not get you out of it. So we do need to be able to react to a real threat. But most of us sitting in our offices are not dealing with physical threats. We're dealing with stressors for sure, but the way that we then react to those stressors is not in keeping with the nature of the challenge. And we're all burned out because our bodies never get to relax. Like, when we're dealing with a physical danger, eventually it's gone. And then we, like, go to sleep, like we take a breath. When this is this constant existential threat that never goes away, our bodies are literally under siege. The energy is unsustainably active all the time, and it's the physiological basis of burnout. Like, it's not just that we get tired one day; it's that the engine that is our mind and body runs out of gas.
Well, we're not going to do that, guys. And, something that I like to do with myself is create like a code word.
Hmm.
And I think that when we talk about burnout, it's a word that is like, it's used enough that maybe it doesn't have the kind of meaning it needs to have. Like, it's not going to shock you into action, is it? Like, I'm burnt out. Like, for me, that's not going to shock me into action. And that's why I love the Sharpening the Axe story so much, because it is a metaphor. As human beings, we think and we learn in stories. That's like how the lessons take hold. That's how the action is going to take shape. And I think that for me, telling myself when I am burnt out is that, like, oh, time to sharpen the axe. And then
Mhm.
however that transpires, that means
Mhm.
focusing on the breath or doing the things that you need to do to, like, not do things for a second. Maybe that's a little bit easier. It no one Do we want to identify as burnouts? Like, I don't know. It takes a lot of different meanings on. But I think that's why that story resonates so much with me, like the axe sharpening thing. I'm down with that. I'm ready for that.
Yeah, and I think that so beautifully captures the other end of this paradigm shift. I sort of laid out the paradigm as it is now, and you've really captured where I think it can go in order to give us a sustainable path. Because I think the false assumption people come to is that if I ease off, nothing's going to get done. Like, the reason why I have to make this choice is because it's the only way to do the things that need to be done. And I'm not denying that there are things that need to be done. In fact, I am very much agreeing and pointing to the fact that if you want to get to the end of this race, then you're maybe going to need to, like, take a pit stop. You're maybe going to need to sharpen the
Mhm.
axe. And if you do frame it proactively, I think that it becomes another tool in the toolbox instead of an admission of some failure.
Yes. 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 That I love, because it's not something to be ashamed of.
Mhm.
It is a point of action. And that for me gets me excited, which
Yes.
is why I probably do so many things, because I'm like, ooh, ooh, yeah, let's do some more things. But that I think is just such an incredible way of looking at it. And I feel like you are awesome and you've addressed so many things that we kind of take as misconceptions about burnout, and it happens to other people, and like how do we deal with it. It's a lot of big words and it's a lot of big thoughts, but ultimately it's you just got to breathe, guys.
Mm.
Right? Like,
I think that the deceptive simplicity of that cannot be overstated.
yeah.
And when we find this shift available to us, one breath at a time, and when we make it into a practice, instead of being under siege, instead of constantly having to make these compromises with our energy, we suddenly find we have some extra. We have this abundance of energy now, and we can creatively and proactively engage with our challenges. It's not that things just aren't challenging magically anymore. It's that we bring our best selves to those challenges by proactively supporting our well being. And that is what this practice is about.
The axe hath been sharpened, everyone. Ben, I really want to thank you for being here today. Ben Carlin, you are the badass behind Freeform Minds, and I am so excited to be able to be candid about these kinds of conversations, about the work that you do and the help that you provide to so many people, especially in business. It
Mm.
is still stigmatized to talk
Mm.
about all of this stuff
Yeah.
and why we need to talk about all of it. And that's why I like to do it, because
Mm.
I love a challenge. And I have to go sharpen my axe.
Well, I will
So,
join you. Thank you so
all
much for
right.
inviting me.
Thank you so much. And I'll talk to you soon.
Certainly.